Castlevania was released in 1986 for the Famicom and ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System a year later. It's the first game in the long-running Castlevania series, which is one of developer Konami's most famous franchises. The game plants the player in a gothic horror setting, Dracula's Castle, which you'll find to be home to many of the most famous popular culture monsters such as Frankenstein and the Grim Reaper. Now, I usually only cover Nintendo first-party games, or at least games that Nintendo themselves developed. And for the vast majority of my videos, that will reign true. But as I continue to explore more and more new games, I feel that it's important to cover a few other notable games that have a history on Nintendo's consoles. Growing up, I would hear about the Castlevania series in various gaming publications. Later on, I started hearing the term Metroidvania to describe particular 2D action games. This is important to note, as Castlevania is a game series that's so iconic, it's now the joint namesake of an entire genre. And the series' notability fully came to a head when two of the series' protagonists, Simon and Richter Belmont, were announced as playable fighters in the latest installment of Super Smash Bros. I wanted to play Castlevania because it's the entry game from a storied franchise that I've heard so frequently about in the past, yet I've never touched a Castlevania game before this one. It's strange because when it comes to my personal gaming tastes, I actually love Metroidvanias. I fell in love with the 2D Metroid games as a kid, and that love for exploration and progression using new power-ups and abilities still exists in me to this day. Despite helping to define one of my all-time favorite gaming genres, the Castlevania series of games has always seemed to elude me. However, the time of me not knowing anything about the Vania side of Metroidvania is now over. Or at least I thought this would be the case. I finally completed Castlevania, and I have to say, for better or for worse, it was not what I was expecting. With prior knowledge of the term Metroidvania, I started Castlevania fully expecting an experience similar to Metroid, where I'd have free roam to explore the castle in an attempt to find items that would grant me new abilities, which in turn would unlock new areas or other secrets. However, I was surprised to learn that in the original Castlevania game, there's little to no exploration of this nature. As the player, you guide the faceless sprite of vampire hunter Simon Belmont through a series of side-scrolling levels, traversing floors and corridors, both horizontally and vertically, through the use of the many staircases found throughout the castle. For the most part, you'll be traveling from point A to point B in this game, just trying to make your way through each stage. There's no need to return to previous areas as there's really nothing to see there. Even though Castlevania was pretty much completely devoid of the exploration element I went into the game expecting, this does not mean I was disappointed. I quickly realized that Castlevania is actually an action platforming game, and one that I really did love once I got acquainted with it. In Castlevania, you're dropped off into the action with pretty much no fanfare. It's up to you to figure out the controls and what to do with the various goods you'll find throughout the castle. Luckily, there are not too many options here, and the initial levels are laid out in such a way that's conducive to your learning. Pretty much every item is introduced early on, giving you ample time to experiment. You'll quickly find that Belmont has a jump, along with his standard whip attack. The base whip attack is pretty small and weak with not much range, but during each one of your lives, you have the chance to collect power-ups for the whip that increase its effectiveness. The power-up system is not like in a Metroid game, where a power-up will stick with you for the rest of the adventure. Rather, your inventory gets wiped out after each death, meaning it's on the player to recollect any items or power-ups they may have collected on a previous attempt. In addition to the whip power-up, there are 5 sub-weapons in the game, and Simon can only possess one of these sub-weapons at any given time. Therefore, it's up to you as the player to determine which out of the axe, the dagger, the stopwatch, the holy water, and the boomerang will be the most effective in the level you're currently facing. The axe can be thrown in a looping pattern, which allows Simon to strike airborne enemies more easily. The dagger is thrown by Simon horizontally as a projectile. The stopwatch can freeze time, rooting all enemies in place for a couple seconds. The holy water can be thrown directly in front of Simon, creating a flame on the ground that will continually damage enemies. And the boomerang is a projectile that flies horizontally, but then flies back to Simon, giving it the potential to strike an enemy twice. While it can be fun to use all the sub-weapons, finding different ways to make the most out of their utility, you'll quickly learn that not all of them are created equal, especially when it comes to taking down bosses. I liked how the sub-weapon system made me all the more desperate to stay alive during each of my runs, because if I were to die, I would lose the current power-up. If it was a sub-weapon I'd brought from a previous level and it was not available in the current stage, that would be my only chance to take advantage of that sub-weapon. So at times, that motivated me to stay alive at all costs. However, there were some moments where I accidentally picked up a sub-weapon I didn't want, and this would often be due to an unfortunate enemy drop. This was pretty frustrating in the moment, but really only a minor gripe in the grand scheme of things. Scattered around the castle, usually found within the many breakable candles or as enemy drops, you'll collect hearts. These hearts power your sub-weapon use, so collecting as many of them as possible is in your best interest. Each use of a sub-weapon uses up only 1 heart, with the exception of the stopwatch, which uses up 5 hearts per attempt. This is probably for the best too, as it stops players from spamming it and constantly stopping all enemy movements. Quite possibly my biggest takeaway from Castlevania is the difficulty spike that occurs mid-game. After getting a hang of the controls, I'd venture to say that the first 3 stages, while not easy, are doable for most players. Upon hitting World 4 and beyond, my death count, and I assume most players' death counts, certainly rose. It was the last 3 worlds where I spent the majority of my time with the game. This is where the greatest challenge occurs. For example, this area, a long straight hallway where birds fly across and drop these jumping monkey enemies. The player must react quickly to the monkeys being dropped, and strike them with the whip before they start jumping around. If you miss the timing window and allow these little guys to start jumping around everywhere, dying here becomes inevitable. The level becomes chaos, as while trying to deal with one jumping monkey, the next bird will inevitably drop another, and another, creating a dangerous cycle that's near impossible to recover from. In addition to all this, the first time you happen to reach the end of the pathway, you'll notice that a bone dragon blocks the exit. Making it past the straightaway section takes some intense focus, and if you hesitate at all at the sight of this bone dragon, not only will you have to deal with it, you'll have to continue dealing with all the birds and monkeys as well. It almost seems like this bone dragon's here to troll the player. It's like the game saying, "Nice job clearing one of the hardest sections, now how about dying right before the exit?" The easiest way to get past this bone dragon is just by charging forward to the exit before it has a chance to fully drop. But there's no way for the player to know this without prior experience of learning the level first. Learning the level seems to be a hallmark of good platformers, especially these retro ones. In my opinion, in order to fully enjoy a game like this, the player must not be afraid to fail and learn from their mistakes. They must be able to find enjoyment out of learning what comes next, able to appreciate discovering the best strategies through trial and error. Castlevania is one of the many action platforming games in which you're not going to clear levels on just a few attempts. It takes failing over and over again to learn the optimal way forward, to develop the required muscle memory to master certain sections. And there's something addicting about this style of game that makes Castlevania a really enjoyable experience, even in the modern day. Even looking at today's best games that are similar in genre, the same core concept of building mastery of the game through arduous trial and error, and using the skills that you cultivate through this repetition to eventually reach that feeling of triumph and accomplishment at the end, still exists. The feeling that you, as the player, learned the game and improved, rather than having just went through the motions. After getting used to some initial awkwardness of control, Castlevania feels fairly slick and modern. The levels, though constrained by 8-bit limitations, are honestly beautiful detailed set pieces that excel well beyond many of the environments from games of a similar era. Take the piles of skeletal remains littering the castle prison, or the iconic walk-up to the final boss with the large crescent moon in the dark sky, helping to signify that you made it to the apex of the castle. It's all really impressive and immersive, helping to create a cohesion between levels that sells the idea that Simon is actually progressing through Dracula's castle area by area rather than a series of unrelated levels. In addition, the high-quality musical score helps add to the immersion of each area, and along with feeling right at home in each particular level, there are a couple tracks that are so catchy, they'll probably stick with you forever. Making my way through Castlevania was difficult, but another thing that surprised me was the consequence of a game over being relatively light. Clearing each world acted as a sort of checkpoint, so getting a game over forces you to restart from the beginning of the world. But this is not so bad, as the worlds are generally pretty short. Plus, it gives you the chance to recollect any power-ups you might have lost along the way. Sure, it can be annoying to repeat sections that were particularly difficult, but I was thankful that a game over didn't mean I had to start over from the castle courtyard all over again. I played Castlevania on the Wii U Virtual Console, so save states were fully available for me, but I have to say I'm pleased that I didn't abuse them to make the game easier. Except I broke during the final boss. I did use save states to practice the fight, so I didn't have to trek through the final level at each game over. I eventually completed it on a clean run though, so in my opinion, I really only half cheated. At first impression, I was really not a fan of Castlevania's controls. The jump felt a bit rigid, straight up and down with no drift. If you jump from a standstill, there's no way to control your aerial movement. Therefore, you have to be mid-stride on the ground first in order to travel any sort of horizontal distance with your jump. It almost seemed like this movement system was a remnant from the arcade era. I could picture myself using a joystick to control Simon and using the machine's buttons for jump, whip, and special. This, along with the numbered stages and score system, makes it seem as though the game was developed for the arcade rather than home consoles. But despite the initial awkwardness, I got accustomed to the control scheme and the game flow, and it happened rather quickly. Once I started feeling more comfortable, I really started to enjoy the experience. Except the Medusa heads in the hallway leading up to death. I'd like to forget that part ever existed. If you're like me and have much more experience with the newer titles rather than the classics, you likely missed this one too. While playing Castlevania, I was reminded a bit of another game that I played recently, Cyber Shadow. Cyber Shadow is another tough action platformer. So if you played that recently too and enjoyed it, I think that you'd find the same types of joy in Castlevania. Castlevania is a pretty tough game, so if you enjoy a challenge and don't get too frustrated at repeated deaths and game overs, I think it's well worth playing. And speaking of deaths and game overs, I think fans of the Donkey Kong Country series would enjoy Castlevania too. So if you liked perhaps Tropical Freeze or any of its predecessors, I would suggest giving this a try. Despite being taken aback from the game not quite fitting my initial expectations, I ended up a bit surprised at how much I actually enjoyed my playthrough. I was really impressed at how nice Castlevania actually looks and sounds, and there were some brutal sections, but I think the difficulty level was just about right. There were times where a particular section felt impossible, but the game allowed me to retry these sections relatively painlessly, making me able to improve quickly as I went along. This led me to conquering sections I once felt were impossible without too much headache. This is an important balance to strike, especially in a game like this, and I feel like Castlevania does it well. I really think that this is one of the main reasons that this game remains such a fan favorite after all these years. When it comes to Castlevania as a series, I definitely want to experience the subsequent games at some point. I'd like to see how well they build on the solid groundwork laid out in the original. But for now, I think I'll try Symphony of the Night next, since I've heard a lot about that one, and it seems to be the most critically acclaimed. Maybe then I'll actually learn what a Vania is, in the modern sense.